It was a warm summer evening in the quiet town of Willowbrook. Tom, a young man in his early 20s, had just finished his day at work and was riding his bike through familiar streets. These after-work rides were one of his favorite ways to unwind. He loved watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting golden light over the rows of houses, each with their own unique charm. As he pedaled down a street lined with old oak trees, he spotted Mrs. Eliza, an elderly woman who lived a few blocks away from him. Tom had known her for as long as he could remember. She was the sweet old lady who always waved at him and his friends, occasionally inviting them over for freshly baked cookies when they were kids. This time, however, something was different. Mrs. Eliza was outside in her front yard, visibly struggling with an old television set. She looked lost in frustration, her usually calm face creased with worry as she fiddled with the buttons and wires. The sight tugged at Tom's heart. It wasn't like her to be out in the yard this late, much less with a TV in tow. Without a second thought, he slowed his bike and approached her, calling out gently, "Mrs. Eliza, are you all right? Need some help with that?" Startled, she looked up, her face brightening as she recognized him. "Oh, Tom, bless your heart. This old TV has finally given up on me. I was hoping to catch my evening show, but I think it's really gone this time." Her voice, usually warm and cheerful, held a hint of disappointment. Tom felt a wave of empathy as he remembered all the times Mrs. Eliza had shared stories of her late husband and the little traditions they had together. One of those was watching their favorite shows on this very TV, an item she held on to dearly, even after her husband passed away years ago. Fixing it meant much more to her than just getting a working television. It was a way to keep her connection to those cherished memories alive. "Let me take a look," Tom offered, placing his bike aside. He had always been good with electronics, and he was more than willing to give it a try. Kneeling beside the TV, he carefully examined the wires and connections. Mrs. Eliza watched him intently, her worry slowly melting into hope as she observed his steady hands and focused gaze. After a few moments of tinkering, Tom spotted the issue: a loose connection that had likely caused the screen to go dark. With a few adjustments, the TV buzzed to life, filling the air with the soft glow of a familiar channel. Mrs. Eliza gasped, her eyes widening with disbelief and gratitude. She clapped her hands together in pure delight. "Oh, Tom, you did it. I thought I'd never see this thing work again," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Tom smiled, his own heart swelling with warmth. "It wasn't too hard, Mrs. Eliza. I'm just glad I could help." For a moment, she looked at him as if seeing him anew, her eyes filled with both gratitude and something deeper. "Thank you, Tom," she whispered, wiping a tear from the corner of her eye. "This TV, it was a gift from my husband, and I thought I'd lost a piece of him forever. You have no idea how much this means to me." Tom felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized just how meaningful this small act of kindness would be. He had only thought of helping her watch her show, but he now saw the true weight of what he had done. As if reading his thoughts, Mrs. Eliza placed a gentle hand on his shoulder and smiled warmly. "Why don't you come inside for a little while? I've just baked a fresh batch of cookies, and it's the least I can do to thank you." Tom's face lit up at the mention of cookies. He remembered how much he had loved them as a kid. "I'd love that, Mrs. Eliza," he replied, feeling a genuine warmth toward the woman who had always been like a grandmother to him. They walked into her cozy home, which was filled with the aroma of chocolate chip cookies and the soft ticking of a grandfather clock. The familiar scent brought a wave of nostalgia over Tom as he settled into a seat at her kitchen table. Mrs. Eliza placed a plate of cookies and a glass of milk in front of him, watching with delight as he took a big bite. "These are just as good as I remember," he said, his voice muffled by the mouthful. For the next hour, Mrs. Eliza and Tom shared stories. She told him about her late husband, Frank, a gentle soul who had served the community as a police officer. She spoke of their adventures, their traditions, and the joy they had found in each other's company. Tom listened intently, hanging on every word. feeling as if he were stepping into another world. He found himself appreciating Mrs. Eliza's resilience, her strength, and the love that still lingered in her words as she spoke about her husband. When it was time for him to leave, Mrs. Eliza walked him to the door and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you again, Tom. You've done more than you know tonight. You brought a little happiness back into this old heart." Tom smiled, feeling a deeper connection to her than he ever had before. "Any time, Mrs. Eliza. You just let me know if you need anything." The next morning, Tom was enjoying a quiet breakfast with his family when there was a knock on the door. His father opened it, revealing none other than Mrs. Eliza, standing there with a police officer. Tom's heart skipped a beat. What could have happened? Was something wrong? 100 questions raced through his mind as he scrambled to his feet. Seeing the concern on Tom's face, Mrs. Eliza quickly reassured him, though there was a flicker of emotion in her eyes that he couldn't quite place. "Tom," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I wanted to introduce you to Officer Harris here." She gestured to the officer beside her, who nodded politely. "And to thank you in a way I never thought possible." Tom's mind was reeling, and he exchanged glances with his parents, who looked just as confused as he felt. But as Mrs. Eliza began to explain, he slowly realized that his simple act of kindness had touched her more deeply than he could have ever imagined. What followed was an unexpected gesture, one that would forever change the course of Tom's life. After that surprising morning visit, Tom found himself thinking about Mrs. Eliza more often. He had sensed something profound in her expression that day, a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. Though he didn't fully understand why she had arrived at his doorstep with a police officer, he knew one thing. Mrs. Eliza appreciated his presence, and it meant the world to her. That very afternoon, Tom decided to pay her another visit. He felt a pull, a desire to check in on her and perhaps share another of her delightful stories over freshly baked cookies. When he arrived, Mrs. Eliza welcomed him with a warm smile, her eyes lighting up with joy at the sight of him. She ushered him into her living room, a cozy space adorned with memories of her past, framed photos of her younger self, standing arm in arm with her late husband Frank, and mementos from their travels. The home was filled with nostalgia, a treasure trove of cherished moments. Mrs. Eliza invited him to sit on the old floral couch, and soon they were chatting away like old friends. As they talked, Mrs. Eliza began to open up about Frank, sharing little snippets of his life. Frank had been more than just a police officer. He had been a beloved figure in the community, known for his kindness and generosity. "He always believed in helping those in need, no matter who they were," she said, her voice brimming with pride. "Frank would often bring home stories from work about the people he met, the lives he touched, and the difference he tried to make." Listening to her, Tom felt an unexpected admiration for Frank, a man he had never met yet felt he somehow knew. He realized that Frank's dedication to serving the community had left a legacy that Mrs. Eliza continued to carry in her heart. The more Mrs. Eliza spoke, the more Tom could see the impact Frank had on her, and he began to understand the depth of her loneliness after Frank's passing. She missed the companionship, the shared memories, and the quiet moments that only they had known. Yet, despite her loss, Mrs. Eliza radiated a warmth and resilience that touched Tom deeply. With each visit, Mrs. Eliza shared more stories about Frank's life and the values he had lived by. She recounted tales of their adventures together, from their cross-country trips in a small camper van to the simple joy of their daily routines. Tom found himself captivated, picturing the young couple traveling across the country, discovering new places, and building memories along the way. He admired the courage it must have taken for Frank to serve the community and the dedication he showed toward his family. Mrs. Eliza's eyes sparkled with a youthful glow whenever she spoke of those days, as if reliving the happiness of that time. One afternoon, as Tom sat beside her in her quaint living room, Mrs. Eliza turned to him with a soft smile. "Tom, you remind me so much of Frank when he was young. He was always willing to lend a hand, just like you." Her words took Tom by surprise, filling him with a warmth he hadn't expected. He had never been compared to someone like Frank before, and it made him feel a sense of pride, as though he were carrying on a legacy he didn't even know existed until recently. In return, Tom began to open up about his own dreams and aspirations. He shared with her his passion for fixing things, his desire to one day become an engineer, and his hope to make a difference in the world. Mrs. Eliza listened intently, her gaze never wavering as she encouraged him to pursue his ambitions. She became his biggest supporter, offering both wisdom and encouragement. "Follow your heart, Tom," she advised gently. "And always remember to keep kindness at the core of everything you do." That's what Frank would have wanted. Their bond deepened with every conversation, and soon, Tom began to see Mrs. Eliza as the grandmother he had always wished for. She was more than just a neighbor. She was a mentor, a friend, and a constant source of support. He admired her resilience, her ability to find joy in small things, and her enduring kindness toward others. In many ways, Mrs. Eliza's outlook on life inspired him to become a better person, someone who would make both her and Frank proud. For her part, Mrs. Eliza found new joy in Tom's company. His visits filled her days with laughter and purpose, and she eagerly awaited the sound of his knock at her door. She fussed over him like a grandmother would, offering him snacks, making sure he was comfortable, and insisting he wear a jacket on chilly days. She also shared with him small lessons, teaching him things she had learned from a lifetime of experiences. "Patience, Tom," she would say with a knowing smile. "Patience is a virtue that will serve you well in everything you do." Her words stayed with him, shaping his outlook and helping him grow in ways he hadn't anticipated. One weekend, Mrs. Eliza suggested they watch one of her favorite nature shows together, a ritual she and Frank had once enjoyed. They sat side by side on her sofa, watching colorful birds flit across the screen, sharing small insights about the world around them. The experience was simple, yet it brought them both a sense of peace and connection. As they sat in comfortable silence, Tom realized just how much he had come to care for Mrs. Eliza. He wasn't just visiting out of kindness anymore. He genuinely enjoyed her company, learning from her stories and soaking up the wisdom she offered so freely. Mrs. Eliza, in turn, became increasingly fond of Tom, viewing him as the grandson she never had. She began to feel a renewed sense of belonging, something she hadn't felt since Frank's passing. Their time together rekindled memories of happier days, and Tom's presence filled her life with laughter, warmth, and hope. She marveled at how a simple act of kindness, a repaired television, had brought this unexpected friendship into her life. She often told him, "Tom, you've brought so much joy back into my heart. You've given me something to look forward to each day, and I can't thank you enough for that." Through their friendship, Tom began to see the world through a different lens. He understood the value of community, the importance of compassion, and the power of human connection. Mrs. Eliza's stories taught him to cherish every moment, to be patient, and to give freely of himself, just as Frank had done. He realized that true kindness wasn't about grand gestures, but about the small, everyday actions that left a lasting impact on others. As the weeks went by, Tom and Mrs. Eliza grew even closer, their bond cemented by shared memories, mutual respect, and a profound understanding that went beyond words. Their friendship blossomed into something beautiful, a relationship that filled the empty spaces in both their lives. For Tom, Mrs. Eliza became a source of guidance, an anchor, and a reminder of the values he wanted to uphold. For Mrs. Eliza, Tom became her family, the light in her life, and a symbol of hope and continuity. Little did Tom know, their friendship would soon lead to a life-changing surprise, a gift that would alter his path in the most unexpected and meaningful way. Weeks passed, and Tom's visits to Mrs. Eliza's house became a regular part of his routine. Every weekend, he would ride his bike over to her cozy home, eager to hear more stories, share his own experiences, and learn from the wisdom she had gathered over her lifetime. Their friendship had grown to be an important part of his life, providing him with insights and guidance he couldn't find elsewhere. He found comfort in her presence, and she, in turn, felt a renewed sense of purpose with Tom by her side. But one afternoon, Mrs. Eliza had something different in mind for him, a surprise that would change his life forever. As Tom entered her living room that day, he noticed a letter on the coffee table, an old-fashioned envelope with an elegant seal. Mrs. Eliza smiled at him warmly, her eyes twinkling with a secret she could barely contain. "Tom," she began, gesturing for him to sit. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you, something I've thought about for a long time." Tom's curiosity was piqued. He had never seen her look so serious yet, so hopeful. He settled into the chair opposite her, trying to keep his excitement in check. "What is it, Mrs. Eliza?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the envelope and handed it to him. "This," she said softly, "is my way of saying thank you and of honoring Frank's memory. He always believed in helping the next generation, and you, Tom, are like the grandson we never had. You've given me so much joy, more than I ever thought possible at this stage in my life, and I want to support you in any way I can." Tom looked down at the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a letter explaining that Mrs. Eliza had set up a scholarship fund in his name, specifically to help him pursue his dream of becoming an engineer. The words on the paper blurred as he read, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what she had done. She was offering him a future, a chance to achieve his dreams in a way he had never thought possible. "Mrs. Eliza, I don't know what to say," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. His eyes filled with tears as he looked up at her, overwhelmed by her generosity. It's incredible. I don't deserve this." Mrs. Eliza reached over, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Tom, you deserve this, and so much more. You have a kind heart, a sharp mind, and a drive to make a difference. Frank would have been so proud of you, just as I am." Tom's heart swelled with gratitude and humility. He had never imagined that his small act of fixing her TV would lead to something so profound. This scholarship wasn't just financial support. It was a symbol of trust and faith in his potential, a tangible reminder that someone believed in him. In that moment, he felt a deep responsibility to live up to her expectations, to carry forward the values she and Frank held dear. Over the following days, Tom couldn't stop thinking about the scholarship. The weight of Mrs. Eliza's kindness filled him with determination, and he vowed to work harder than ever. His dream of becoming an engineer, which had once seemed distant, now felt within reach. He began spending more time studying, poring over textbooks, and honing his skills. Every time he felt doubt creep in, he would think of Mrs. Eliza's words and the incredible gift she had given him. Her belief in him became his strength, fueling his resolve to succeed. For Mrs. Eliza, watching Tom embrace his future was a joy beyond measure. She saw in him the same dedication and compassion that had defined Frank's life. Whenever she saw him lost in a book or diligently working on a project, she felt a surge of pride, knowing that she had played a small role in helping him reach his goals. Her husband's legacy lived on through Tom, and it brought her a sense of peace and fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. One evening, Tom invited his parents over to Mrs. Eliza's house for tea. He wanted them to meet the woman who had become so important in his life and to share in the joy of her gift. His parents, touched by Mrs. Eliza's kindness, expressed their heartfelt gratitude, and a newfound friendship blossomed between them. As they sat together in her cozy living room, laughter filled the air, and Mrs. Eliza felt as though she were part of a family once more. She watched Tom's parents with warmth, glad to see the same values of kindness and respect reflected in their lives. As the night wore on, Mrs. Eliza retrieved a small box from a drawer and handed it to Tom. Inside was a watch that had belonged to Frank, a simple yet elegant piece with a leather band. "This watch was Frank's," she said softly, her voice laced with nostalgia. "He wore it every day, and it was his reminder to make the most of his time. I want you to have it, Tom, as a symbol of the legacy you're carrying forward. Tom carefully fastened the watch around his wrist, feeling the weight of its significance. He looked up at Mrs. Eliza, his eyes filled with gratitude and determination. "I promise I'll make you proud," he said solemnly, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll honor this gift, and I'll work to make a difference in the world, just like Frank did." Mrs. Eliza pulled him into a gentle embrace, her heart swelling with pride and love. "I know you will, Tom," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I believe in you, and so did Frank. Go out there and make your dreams come true." From that day forward, Tom wore the watch every day, a constant reminder of the kindness and generosity that had changed his life. It became more than just an accessory. It was a symbol of hope, resilience, and the legacy of a man who had dedicated his life to helping others. The watch kept him grounded, reminding him of the values that Mrs. Eliza had taught him, and of the responsibility he now held to live up to her faith in him. The scholarship and the watch became Tom's driving force, propelling him toward his goals with a newfound sense of purpose. He worked tirelessly, motivated by the promise he had made to Mrs. Eliza, and by the belief that he could one day make a difference in the lives of others, just as she had made a difference in his. Through her generosity, Tom found the strength to pursue his dreams, knowing that he wasn't alone, that someone believed in him wholeheartedly. Mrs. Eliza continued to be a constant presence in his life, cheering him on every step of the way. She watched with pride as he grew, witnessing the positive impact her gift had on him. For both of them, the scholarship wasn't just an opportunity. It was a bond that would last forever, a testament to the power of kindness, love, and the human spirit. Through her actions, Mrs. Eliza showed Tom that one small act of kindness could change a life forever. She gave him the gift of a future, and in return, Tom promised to carry forward her husband's legacy, a legacy built on compassion, empathy, and unwavering support for others. Their journey together became a story of mutual respect, gratitude, and the understanding that true wealth lies not in material possessions, but in the lives we touch and the love we give. In time, Tom would go on to achieve his dreams, but he would never forget the woman who had made it all possible. And every time he looked at the watch on his wrist, he would be reminded of the promise he made to Mrs. Eliza, a promise to make her proud, to honor her kindness, and to pass on the legacy of love and generosity to the next generation. With the scholarship fund and Frank's watch fastened securely around his wrist, Tom felt a new sense of purpose guiding his life. Every morning, as he glanced at the watch before starting his day, he was reminded of Mrs. Eliza's kindness and the legacy of her late husband. The watch wasn't just a timepiece. It was a silent encouragement, a call to live up to the example set by Frank, a man who had dedicated his life to helping others. Inspired by this legacy, Tom decided it was time to do more for his community, just as Frank would have done. His first step was to volunteer at the local community center, a place that provided resources, activities, and support for people of all ages. Tom had passed by the center countless times, but had never given it much thought until now. When he walked through its doors, he was greeted by the center's coordinator, Miss Thompson, a warm woman with a ready smile and a welcoming demeanor. "Hello, Tom," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "We're so glad to have you here. Are you ready to make a difference?" Tom nodded, feeling a surge of excitement. "Yes, I am," he replied, his voice filled with determination. He knew this was where he was meant to be. The community center was bustling with activity. Children ran around laughing, adults chatted and shared stories, and elderly folks participated in various classes. It was a lively, vibrant environment, and Tom felt instantly at home. He began his first day assisting with the after-school program for young kids, helping them with their homework, organizing activities, and offering a friendly ear to those who needed someone to talk to. As the days turned into weeks, Tom found himself growing closer to the people at the center. He learned the names of the children he tutored, listened to the stories of the elderly, and shared laughs with the other volunteers. Each day brought a new challenge, but also a new reward. The work wasn't always easy. Some days were exhausting, and he often found himself mentally and physically drained. But every time he saw the grateful smiles on people's faces, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was making a difference, no matter how small, and it filled him with a deep, quiet pride. One afternoon, as Tom was helping a young boy with his math homework, he thought back to the times Mrs. Eliza had sat with him, guiding him patiently and sharing her own wisdom. Her lessons had taught him the value of patience, of listening, and of truly being present for others. And now, he was passing those same lessons on to the kids at the center. The realization filled him with gratitude, reminding him of the lasting impact Mrs. Eliza had made on his life. In the evenings, Tom would often visit Mrs. Eliza, eager to share stories about his volunteer work. She listened with rapt attention, her face lighting up with pride every time he described a new accomplishment or a challenge he had overcome. One evening, as he recounted his experiences with a particularly shy child who had slowly started to open up to him, Mrs. Eliza reached over and squeezed his hand. "Tom," she said, her voice full of warmth, "you're doing exactly what Frank would have wanted. You're making a difference in this world, one person at a time." Her words touched him deeply, and he felt the weight of her pride settle warmly in his heart. It was moments like these that reminded him of why he had chosen this path. He wasn't just volunteering to fill his time. He was there to honor Frank's legacy and to bring light into the lives of others, just as Mrs. Eliza had done for him. As Tom continued his work at the center, he found himself drawn to a new project, a mentorship program for teens. Many of these young people came from challenging backgrounds, and he saw in them a reflection of himself at their age, full of potential yet often lacking direction. He wanted to give them the guidance and encouragement that Mrs. Eliza had given him, to help them believe in their abilities and see a future filled with possibilities. Under Miss Thompson's guidance, Tom began organizing weekly mentorship sessions where he shared practical skills, offered career advice, and most importantly, listened to the teens' hopes and fears. He encouraged them to set goals, to work hard, and to remember that no dream was too big. Week after week, he watched them grow in confidence, their eyes lighting up with new ambition. One by one, they started to believe in themselves, and Tom couldn't have been prouder. Each time he felt doubt creep in, when he wondered if he was truly making a difference, he would glance at the watch on his wrist, feeling Frank's spirit guiding him. The watch had become a symbol of his commitment, a reminder that every small act of kindness contributed to something larger than himself. He carried it with him as a badge of honor, a silent promise to live up to the ideals Mrs. Eliza and Frank had taught him. In time, Tom's work at the center began to ripple outward. He organized community events, bringing together people of all ages to foster a sense of unity and shared purpose. He arranged for local businesses to provide donations and resources, and even started a small scholarship fund, inspired by the one Mrs. Eliza had given him, to support young people pursuing higher education. With each step he took, he felt Mrs. Eliza's influence guiding him, encouraging him to be bold, compassionate, and unafraid of making a difference. One weekend, Tom invited Mrs. Eliza to visit the community center and see the impact of her support firsthand. She arrived with a mixture of excitement and nostalgia, marveling at the energy and vibrancy around her. Tom introduced her to the children, the teens, and the elderly people he worked with, each of whom greeted her warmly. Many of them had heard stories about her from Tom, and they welcomed her as if she were an old friend. Mrs. Eliza was deeply moved by the sense of community and the positive change that Tom had brought to the center. As they walked through the center together, she looked at him with a proud smile. "You've done so much, Tom," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I couldn't be prouder of the person you've become. You've truly carried Frank's legacy forward." Tom squeezed her hand, feeling a swell of emotion rise within him. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Mrs. Eliza. You believed in me when no one else did, and that gave me the courage to follow this path. You and Frank have been my guiding lights." For Mrs. Eliza, seeing the lives Tom had touched brought her a sense of peace and fulfillment. She had once thought that her best years were behind her, but Tom had shown her that there was still so much she could give and receive. Their friendship had rekindled a joy in her heart, and she felt as though she were once again a part of something meaningful, something that would outlast her and continue to make a difference. As they said their goodbyes that day, Tom promised her that he would keep working, keep helping, and keep making a difference. He had found a purpose that extended beyond his own dreams, a purpose rooted in the values she and Frank had instilled in him. It was a calling to serve, to uplift others, and to be the kind of person who leaves the world a little better than they found it. From that day forward, Tom's sense of purpose burned brighter than ever. He had seen the impact of kindness, of a supportive hand, and of the simple act of believing in someone. And every step he took, every life he touched, he did so with a heart full of gratitude for Mrs. Eliza and the legacy she had entrusted him with. Together, they had built a legacy of compassion, resilience, and community. A legacy that Tom would carry forward, knowing that, through him, the spirit of Frank and Mrs. Eliza would live on. As the years passed, Tom's work at the community center and his dedication to helping others became well known throughout the town. He continued to honor the legacy of Mrs. Eliza and Frank in every way he could, organizing new programs, mentoring young people, and building scholarships to give others the opportunities that had once been given to him. He pursued his studies in engineering, excelling with the motivation that came from knowing his education was a gift of love and trust. With every achievement, he felt a renewed responsibility to make a difference. Tom's relationship with Mrs. Eliza continued to deepen over time, becoming a cornerstone of his life. She attended his college graduation, beaming with pride as he received his diploma. When he began his first job as an engineer, Mrs. Eliza was the first person he called to share the good news. Her voice, filled with joy and pride, was all the encouragement he needed to take on the challenges that lay ahead. She had become his family in every way, her presence a reminder of the kindness and support that had set him on his path. But the years also brought moments of bittersweet change. As Mrs. Eliza grew older, her health began to decline. Tom was by her side every step of the way, providing her with the same care and companionship she had once given him. In her final days, she reminded him of the importance of living a life filled with kindness, compassion, and love. "Tom," she whispered one evening, her voice barely a murmur, "keep spreading joy, keep helping others. It's the best way to honor Frank, and to honor the person you've become." When Mrs. Eliza passed, Tom felt an overwhelming loss, yet also a deep gratitude for the time they had shared. At her funeral, he spoke of her unwavering kindness and the lessons she had taught him about resilience, generosity, and the power of connection. Surrounded by friends, family, and the community they had built together, Tom made a promise. He would continue her legacy, using every opportunity to make the world a little better, just as she and Frank had done. With renewed dedication, Tom expanded his efforts. He founded a nonprofit in honor of Mrs. Eliza and Frank, aimed at providing scholarships, mentorship, and support for underprivileged youth. The organization became a place where young people could find guidance, just as he had found in Mrs. Eliza. Each success story that emerged from the nonprofit was a testament to the enduring impact of their kindness and generosity. As Tom's journey shows us, the power of a single act of kindness can ripple out to touch countless lives. In a world that often feels divided and disconnected, we each have the ability to create change by starting small, helping a neighbor, listening to someone who needs it, or offering our skills to those who might benefit. Tom's story is a reminder that we don't have to do grand things to make a difference. Sometimes, the simplest acts have the greatest impact. If Mrs. Eliza's legacy has inspired you, consider how you might bring that spirit of generosity into your own life. volunteer at a local shelter, mentor someone who could use a guiding hand, or simply reach out to a friend or family member in need. Let's build communities rooted in compassion, one act of kindness at a time. Together, we can create a world where everyone feels seen, supported, and valued. So, go out there and make a difference. Be the reason someone believes in the goodness of people. Just as Tom found his purpose through Mrs. Eliza's kindness, we all have the power to change lives. Embrace it and let the legacy of kindness live on.